Great, thank you. And thank you all for coming. I'm going to speak a little bit tonight about the recent Supreme Court ruling, but mainly I'm going to focus on the issues that were underlying that case. I don't think the opinion itself is particularly insightful, particularly helpful in asking the questions and the issues that were most driving the debate in the United States for the past decade or more. But where I want to begin is with 50 years ago. It was 50 years ago that Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote his infamous report on the state of the black family. Moynihan pointed out 50 years ago that births to single mothers in the general population were in the single digits, but within the black family, births to single moms were approaching 25%. And he wrote the report because he was concerned that this would have negative consequences for those children, for those mothers, and for those communities. Moynihan was roundly criticized for being a racist because he wrote this report. What's ironic about that is that Moynihan was a Democratic liberal senator from the state of New York. He was a liberal professor of sociology at Harvard University. And it was precisely because he wasn't a racist that he wrote that report. It was precisely because he cared about African American kids and their mothers and those families that he thought something needed to be done, that while the general population births to single moms are in single digits, within that community, roughly a quarter of all children are being born to single moms. He said something's taking place and we need to figure out what's causing it and what we can do to combat it. Fast forward to today. Today, 40% of all American children are born to single mothers. It's 50% of Hispanic kids, and it's over 70% of African Americans are born to single moms. Gays and lesbians aren't to blame for this. It's not same-sex marriage or gays and lesbians in any way, shape, or form that are to blame for the dramatic increase that we've seen in the past 50 years of non-marital childbearing. So the first thing to say about tonight's talk is that the emphasis here is on marriage, not the same-sex part. The reason that I'm going to talk about same-sex marriage is I think it's part of a long line of negative redefinitions of marriage. It wasn't gays and lesbians who are to blame for the breakdown of the family during the past 50 years. It was heterosexuals who bought into a bad liberal ideology about sex, about the family, about marriage, who are to blame for those troubling statistics that Moynihan first pointed out to us. And now another Harvard scholar, Robert Putnam, on the left, and Charles Murray at the American Enterprise Institute on the right have pointed out to us. They both documented the 40, 50, and 70% statistic. The reason I open that way is to say that if you think that the past 50 years has been good for America's children, for America's mothers, for America's families, then by all means you should cheer the decision that just came from the US Supreme Court. Because there is a certain logic to the redefinition of marriage. What took place to cause the phenomenon that Moynihan first noticed was something known as the sexual revolution. It was a series of ideas that more or less said that consenting adults should do whatever consenting adults want to do. That the only value at stake when it comes to human sexuality, marriage, and the family is consent. And so if you have that ideology, that understanding of human embodiment and of human sexuality, it's not surprising that out of the sexual revolution you get the hookup culture, you get the rise of premarital sex, you get the more than doubling in the rates of non-marital childbearing, you get the normalization of cohabitation, you get the more than doubling in the rates of divorce, and you get the introduction of no-fault divorce laws. So here's 50 years. In 50 years' time, we can see all of those social changes to the institution of marriage, to human sexuality, that straight people brought about. Gays and lesbians were simply taking that logic to its logical conclusion, saying if marriage is simply about consenting adult romance and caregiving, why can't our relationship be a marriage? The problem here is that it's the logical conclusion of a bad train of logic. It's founded on bad premises about human nature, about the human person. It's founded on a bad understanding of what marriage is and what the purposes of marriage are, and then takes all of those faulty starting points and works it out to their logical conclusions. That's more or less in a nutshell what first got me interested in this question as someone who has researched and written 2 books about it. I did my PhD in political philosophy, and I thought it was an interesting question of, well, what makes the political community different than the marital community? What makes the marital community different than other forms of communities? Because despite what Anthony Kennedy says in the opinion, everyone in this debate is in favor of marriage equality. I have not met a single person, and I doubt there's a single person in this auditorium tonight who's against marriage equality. We all want the law to treat all marriages in the same way. We want the law to treat all marital relationships equally. What we disagree about is what sort of a consenting adult relationship is a marriage. What makes the marital community different than the political community, different than the academic community, different than the business community? What is it that makes a marriage a marriage? So the first book that I co-authored with a classmate of mine at Princeton and with a professor of ours there was simply titled, What is Marriage? And the subtitle was Man and Woman, a Defense. Because it was that question that we thought was the central question in this debate, and it's the question that many on the left refuse to answer. So it's interesting to see when people protest about the same-sex marriage issue, they'll talk about equality, they'll say love equals love, they'll say that they're against bigotry, they're against homophobia, they're against this, that, and the other thing. They'll never actually say what they're for and what they think marriage is. It's simply remarkable that in a 10-year plus debate about marriage, we heard very few people in favor of same-sex marriage actually defending marriage. Why should marriage be a permanent, monogamous, exclusive union of 2 people once you get rid of the male-female part of marriage? You know, what is it about marriage that requires that it have these contours, and only these contours? Even those in favor of redefining marriage to include same-sex couples, at least for now, aren't in favor of redefining marriage to include other arrangements of consenting adults. So even those who say they're in favor of marriage equality for the couple have limits on what type of a relationship should be extended marriage equality. The question for tonight's lecture is, how do we draw the right lines? If we're going to have marriage policy that's based on principle and not simply on popular vote, not simply on mob rule, we need to be able to draw those lines based on the truth about what marriage is. Marriage equality depends upon marriage reality. And only if you can know what a marriage is and what the marital relationship is, can you know whether any given marriage policy is respecting equality or denying equality. So that's where I want to start. And I just want to say a couple of words about my approach to this. As I mentioned, this first book that I had done was co-authored with a classmate and a professor of mine at Princeton. All 3 of us are political philosophers. They're both legal scholars as well. So we come at this from a secular perspective, a philosophical, a social science, a jurisprudential, a constitutional law perspective. So I'm not going to talk about the theology of marriage. I'm not going to talk about the Bible. I'm not going to talk about revelation or scripture. I'm simply going to talk about human nature, about natural law, about philosophy, about social science, and about public policy. So I'm also not going to say anything about sexual orientation or homosexuality, because I don't think that cuts one way or the other in this debate. There are people who are in favor of same-sex sexual activity who don't think a same-sex relationship is a marital relationship. You could start your list with Plato. So Plato, throughout his philosophy, talks about same-sex male relationships in a favorable way, Socrates in particular, and yet he doesn't think the same-sex sexual relationship is a marital relationship. So regardless of what your evaluation of gay relationships are, you still have to ask the question of what makes a marriage a marriage. And the reason I start by citing the Moynihan report and by saying that gays and lesbians aren't to blame for this, straight people are, is that the true visions of marriage that are on offer today in American life don't cut either way on the orientation question. There are plenty of straight people who have bought into what I'm going to describe as the revisionist view of marriage. And so let me just start there by saying a few words about the revisionist view of marriage. What we were doing when we were researching the book is we wanted to look for those who had answered the question about what marriage is, who were in favor of redefining marriage. What was their implicit understanding about marriage? What were they operating on as their philosophical understanding of what makes a marriage a marriage? And the answer that we found was that marriage was simply about an intense emotional union. And that what makes marriage different than other friendships, what makes marriage different than other relationships, was the intensity of the union, the priority that it had in the partner's lives. There's a philosopher at Wayne State University, John Corvino. He said what makes marriage distinctive from other relationships is that it's the relationship that establishes your, quote, number one person. Your other relationships are less important, they're less intense. They're not your number one, they're your number two through infinity. What we argued was that this vision of marriage simply gets marriage wrong. This vision of marriage simply collapses marriage with companionship in general. It simply makes the difference between marriage and best friendship a matter of degree. It has more intensity, it has greater priority, rather than a difference in kind. And that a sound philosophy of marriage would see that the marital relationship is different in kind from other types of human relationships. It's different in kind from the athletic community, from the academic community, from the business community, from the best friend community. Worse than that, though, this revisionist understanding of marriage can't explain any of the historic American marital norms. It can't explain why marriage should be a permanent union. If marriage is simply an intense, emotional, romantic, caregiving union, why can't it be permanent? Our emotions, they come and they go, they wax and they wane. What is it about marriage just as such that would require it to be a permanent relationship if marriage is simply about intense, romantic, consenting adult love? Likewise, what is it about marriage that would require it to be an exclusive relationship? Some people might say that their marriage is enhanced by only sleeping with their spouse, that it enhances their romance, it enhances their emotional connection. Other people might say the opposite, that it's stifling to only have one sexual partner, and that their romantic emotional connection with their spouse is actually enhanced if they can find sexual outlets outside of marriage. What is it about this vision of marriage that would require sexual exclusivity? And then lastly, what is it about this vision of marriage that would require monogamy? If marriage is simply about consenting adult romance and caregiving, why is marriage the type of union that two and only two consenting adults can enter into? And then lastly, what is it about this understanding of marriage that says the government should be in the marriage business at all? Government doesn't regulate your best friendships. Why is government in the marriage business if it's just about consenting adult romance and caregiving? What is it about marriage as such that makes it a matter of public and not just private concern? So we argue that this vision of marriage simply gets marriage wrong, and that there's nothing heterosexual or homosexual about it. That many straight people bought into this understanding of marriage throughout the past 50 years. That if you have this vision of marriage, it would explain the rise of the hookup culture, it would explain the rise of cohabitation, it would account for the rise of non-marital childbearing and the rise of the rates of divorce. That a bad understanding of marriage would lead to a bad practice of marriage. And so that's what's at stake here. Is this vision of marriage a good or a bad one? Let me give you the alternative vision, and I'm going to argue for why I think the historic vision of marriage is a better understanding of what marriage is, and therefore it doesn't deny anyone marriage equality to recognize in law the truth about marriage. So what we do in that first book, and what I do in a more abbreviated form in this newer book, is borrow a method from Aristotle. Aristotle is the ancient Greek pagan philosopher about 2,500 years ago. He taught us that you can analyze any sort of a community by looking at three factors of the community. Look at the actions that the community members perform. Look at the goods that the community members are ordered towards. And then look at the norms that the community members live out. Look at the commitments that community members make to one another. And so we said, all right, let's apply this to marriage. Let's look at the marital act, the marital good, and the marital norms. But to illustrate this, because this way of thinking seems foreign to people, we started with a university, an academic community, to show how this framework operates. So let me use a university community as my example. What makes a college an academic community and not just an athletic community and a business community? You know, some schools are just football teams and annual giving campaigns. Why is that not the crux of what makes a university a university? The first step is academic action. What makes a university is that the members of the university engage in academic actions. What do academic actions look like? Professors deliver lectures and students attend lectures. Professors write books and articles. Students will read those books, read those articles. Professors will then write up exams. Students take the exams. Professors grade the exams. Students write term papers. Professors grade in the term papers. They then go to office hours. They have discussions about these things. They have discussion sections. These are the sorts of activities, the sort of academic actions that make a university a university. The tailgates and the annual giving campaigns are necessary, they're additional, they're add-ons, but they don't go to the heart of what makes a university an academic institution. What are all of those actions ordered towards? You know, what is it that you as students and your professors as faculty members are seeking when you're doing those things? You're seeking the truth. The academic good that those actions are ordered towards is the good of knowledge of the truth. What you seek to do is eliminate ignorance from your life. You seek to get rid of false opinions and acquire true beliefs, which then explains the norms that govern academic life. This is where things like the honor code and citing all of your sources and not plagiarizing your term papers and not data mining and not selectively quoting the works of other scholars all come into play. Because if the purpose of the academic actions are to acquire the academic good of knowledge, then you want to cite all of your sources so other scholars can check your work. You don't want to plagiarize your papers because you don't want to take credit for someone else's work. Which is why, as a scholar, if someone comes along and corrects you, so as a student, if a professor corrects your term paper, you shouldn't view it as an insult. You should actually view it as the mutual pursuit of truth. The peer review process, the give and take of the academy is precisely how ideas get refined and they get better, and bad ideas fall to the wayside and good ideas get promoted. So you can see the connection, given what an academic community is all about, between the actions, the goods, and the norms. Let's do the same thing on marriage. We argue that marriage, what makes it different than other relationships is that it's a comprehensive relationship. It's a comprehensive communion, and it's comprehensive in those three factors. It's comprehensive in the act that unites spouses. There's going to be an act that unites spouses at all levels of their humanity. It's comprehensive in the goods that spouses are ordered towards. There's going to be a good that transcends partial goods and temporary goods. It's going to be a comprehensive good. And then it's comprehensive in the norms that it requires. It's going to require comprehensive commitments from the spouses. What does this look like? There's a marital act that unites spouses' hearts, minds, and bodies. Whereas ordinary friendships, ordinary relationships are unions of hearts and minds, the marital relationship is going to have a bodily component. And so that's going to raise the question of how do you unite bodily with another person. The marital good is going to be a comprehensive good. It's going to be the good of creating new life and then cooperating with one another, husband and wife, mother and father, to raise a new life, to participate in all of the forms of human goodness. And then it's going to call for comprehensive commitments, a comprehensive commitment throughout time. That's the pledge of permanency, till death do us part. And then a comprehensive commitment at every moment of time. That's the exclusive commitment, the pledge of fidelity. Let me unpack those three steps. This is the densest part of tonight's talk. This is something that all of our grandparents understood as simply common sense, as a self-evident truth. But now that it's been under criticism, it's been called into question, it now requires a philosophical defense. So let me unpack those three steps of the argument. The first step was that there's a comprehensive act that unites spouses at all levels of their humanity. The first question to ask is, what are human beings? Because if you're going to unite comprehensively with another human being, you need to know what is it that you and I are as human creatures. To unite comprehensively with another human being will require uniting at all levels of your humanity. So if we were just ghosts and machines, if we were just consciousnesses or spirits or souls that somehow inhabited bodies, then the body would just be an instrument, and a bodily union wouldn't be essential to a personal union. But because we're embodied beings, you can think of it either as an ensouled body or as an embodied soul. Whatever way you think of it, we're a mind-body unity. We're a psychosomatic whole. Because of that understanding of our anthropology, to unite comprehensively with another person will be a union that includes a bodily union, because bodily union will be personal union. So it's going to be a union of hearts, minds, and bodies. That then raises the question of, well, what is it that makes any one of us one body? If I want to unite with another body, I first want to know, well, what is it that makes me a unified body? So the answer here is that some people say that we're just clumps of cells. You hear this particularly in the abortion debate, that the unborn child is just a clump of cells. Those people are wrong, and they're wrong for a rather simple reason, that we're not a clump of cells, because all of the various cells in our body, all of the various organs in our body, all of the various tissues and muscles, bones, skin, lungs, heart, kidney, liver, all the rest, they're all integrated with one another for the common good of our unified existence. They're integrated, they're coordinating with each other towards a common end. So we're not just a clump of cells or a heap of parts or a heap of tissue, but all of our various subsystems coordinate and unify with one another for the common good of our existence. Now, all of those subsystems that I mentioned are complete as an individual. So when it comes to locomotion, we all walked in here on our own, and when the lecture's over, we'll all walk out on our own. When it comes to digestion, if you had dinner before tonight's lecture, you're digesting it right now on your own. When it comes to respiration, you're breathing on your own. When it comes to circulation, your heart is pumping, and it's pumping oxygenated blood throughout your body on your own. All of those various systems, the circulatory system, the digestive system, respiration system, they're all complete as an individual. They're all unified, coordinating, integrating with each other. We're all radically incomplete with respect to one bodily system. Each and every one of us has half of a potential whole when it comes to one bodily function, which allows for the fact that we're both male and female, that we can unite in an act that unifies us with respect to that bodily function as an integrated, coordinating whole. So that when a man and a woman unite in that conjugal act, they truly become one flesh. It's not the same thing as if I lick my finger and stick it in someone's ear. We haven't truly become one integrated, united, unified whole. I've given someone a wet willy. And no one's ever confused that for consummating a marriage. And yet in the common law of England, the canon law of the church, and the civil law of the United States, so a remarkable overlapping consensus of secular and sacred of various political communities, the marital act is what consummated a marriage, because it was the marital act that unified spouses, a man and a woman, as husband and wife. That when the book of Genesis talks about the true becoming one flesh, it's not speaking metaphorically or poetically. It's revealing something that's true about human nature, that at the physical and the metaphysical level, when a man and a woman unite in that conjugal act, they truly become one entity. And they become one entity to such a great extent that 9 months later, it might require a name. And that begins us to tell us something about what the good of the marital union is ordered towards. In the same way that academic actions are ordered towards the academic good of knowledge of the truth, so too the marital act is ordered towards the marital good of both the intimacy of the spouses and the creation and then the rearing of new human lives. So a way of thinking about this is that the lovemaking act is also the life-giving act. It's one and the same action that makes a man and a woman husband and wife that also can make them mother and father. And that tells us something about the comprehensive good that marriage is ordered towards. It's not ordered to the good of winning the next football game or passing the next Shakespeare test. It's ordered towards probably the most comprehensive good you could do on earth, creating new life and then cooperating with the other person who helped you create that new life to raise that new life to become a self-sufficient, productive member of society. It sets your entire life on a new trajectory. When you become married, when you become a parent, it comprehensively changes your life trajectory had you not gotten married, had you not become a parent, in a way that other goods are more temporary or more limited. The marital good is going to be comprehensive like the marital act, which then leads to the comprehensive norms. Because I imagine most of you, if you live on campus, you haven't committed to living with your freshman year roommate till death do you part. Right? So the type of commitment that you make to your freshman year roommate is not a comprehensive commitment. Most of you, when you graduate from here and you get your first job, you're not going to make a comprehensive commitment to your first boss. You're not signing that contract for life. But when you get married, you do make a comprehensive commitment to your spouse. The expectation for marriage is that it's for life, that it's comprehensive throughout time. And this can explain why marriage, unlike other relationships, has that expectation of permanency. It can also explain why marriage is an exclusive relationship and why it's exclusive with respect to the sexual aspect of marriage. So none of you are cheating on your spouse by attending this lecture tonight if your spouse is back at home. Marriage doesn't call for intellectual exclusivity. If you go to the gym and your lifting partner is someone other than your spouse, you don't cheat on your spouse. If you sleep with someone other than your spouse, you do cheat on your spouse. Because the act that's distinctive to marriage, that marital act, is a sexual act, because it's that act that transforms ordinary relationships of hearts and minds into the bodily dimension, that transforms them into marital relationships. And so that's the action that is reserved for marriage. That's the type of exclusivity that spouses pledge to each other. It's a sexual exclusivity, sexual fidelity. Now, this basic understanding of marriage is something that we see articulated throughout human history by a wide range of thinkers. You can find a basic sketch of something like this in the ancient Greeks and Romans. You can see it in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thinkers. You can see it in Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Immanuel Kant. You can find it in Eastern thinkers like Gandhi. They won't all use the same Aristotelian jargon of acts, goods, and norms. They won't use all the same vocabulary and structure that my co-authors and I use. But they're all, with greater or lesser success, groping to articulate something along these lines. Because they've all, with greater or lesser success, latched on to some basic truths about human nature, and they've tried to articulate why these truths about human nature have given rise to the institution of marriage throughout human history and across the globe. This isn't just an invention of 21st century Protestant America. This is something that we see more or less with greater or lesser success in articulation and greater or lesser success being lived out, more haziness at the fringes, more clarity at the center throughout human history. Which then raises the question of, well, why does this matter? Because you could say that you're following me up until this part in tonight's talk, that there's a revisionist understanding of marriage and sexuality that comes out of the sexual revolution that says consent is the only value that matters, that this is what comes out of the 60s that says consenting adults should do whatever consenting adults want to do. It's what gives us the hookup culture and non-marital childbearing and divorce and all of the rest. And you could say, yeah, that's a bad understanding of marriage, and that you simply don't want to redefine marriage to include every consenting adult relationship, because then everything is marriage and therefore nothing's marriage, that you need to be able to draw lines, and that the revisionist view of marriage simply is unable to draw any lines. So you could say, all right, the revisionists have gotten it wrong. You could then be saying, and we follow what you're saying about this Aristotelian approach to marriage based upon a comprehensive act that unites spouses at all levels of their humanity, that's ordered towards a comprehensive good of the well-being of the spouses, the creation of new life, the raising of new life, and comprehensive commitments, a permanent and an exclusive commitment. You could say, I agree with everything you've said so far, but why does any of it matter? And in particular, why does it matter to the government? We don't have government in the bar mitzvah business. We don't have government in the baptism business. Why do we have government in the marriage business? So let me answer that question in the next couple of minutes. Why does marriage matter? In particular, why does it matter as a public and not simply a private or religious institution? The simplest way of answering this is to say that marriage exists as a public institution to unite a man and a woman as husband and wife, so they can then be mother and father to any children that that union creates. That it's based on three secular truths: an anthropological truth that men and women are distinct and complementary, a biological fact that reproduction requires both a man and a woman, and a social reality that children deserve both a mother and a father. When you add those three things together, you can understand why diverse political, philosophical, and theological communities throughout human history have had the institution of marriage and have had their governments involved in it. Whenever a child is born, a mother will always be close by. She'll normally be in the very same room. That's a simple fact of biology. You can laugh at that. It's meant to be a joke. You just suffered through like 10 minutes of boring Aristotelian philosophy, so it'll get lighter now. The question, though, the question for law, the question for public policy, the question for culture is, will a father be close by? And if so, for how long? Marriage is an institution that diverse societies across the globe throughout human history devise to maximize the likelihood that that father commits to that mother, and then the two of them, committed to each other, will commit to that child. Because when this doesn't happen, social costs run high. When this fails to happen in the first place, or when it falls apart prematurely, the consequences for those children, for those mothers, for those communities run high. Part of this also has to do with the fact there's no such thing as parenting. There's no such thing as parenting in the abstract. There's mothering and there's fathering. Men and women bring different tangible gifts to the parenting enterprise, and children tend to do best when they have both a mother and a father, particularly when they have their mother and their father taking care of them. Let me read you a quote from the sociologist David Popenoe. David Popenoe teaches at Rutgers University. He did a literature review of the social science on parenting, and this is what he concluded. The burden of social science evidence supports the idea that gender-differentiated parenting is important for human development, and that the contribution of fathers to child-rearing is unique and irreplaceable. He then concludes, quote, we should disavow the notion that mommies can make good daddies, just as we should disavow the popular notion that daddies can make good mommies. The two sexes are different to the core, and each is necessary culturally and biologically for the optimal development of a human being, end quote. So let me illustrate what Professor Popenoe is trying to get at when he says that moms and dads are different and that both are necessary for the optimal development of a human being. If I tell you it's Saturday morning and a 5-year-old boy is in the living room and he's wrestling with one of his parents, and the parent is teaching the boy that it's okay to put people in headlocks, but it's not okay to bite or to pull hair or to gouge out eyes, which parent is most likely in the living room? And the laughter gives away that it's probably the father in the living room. And now this isn't because we've engaged in a global conspiracy of gender conformity and stereotyping in which only fathers can wrestle in living room carpets with their sons. It's that this is what comes naturally to dads. This is what comes naturally to guys in general. Guys like roughhousing with each other, and they like roughhousing with their kids in particular. It's the same thing that normally it's fathers who are throwing newborn babies up in the air, and it tends to be mothers who say, honey, not so high. And again, it's not because of global conspiracy of gender conformity. It's that there's something about carrying a child in your womb for 9 months that'll make mothers naturally be more protective, more nurturing, more compassionate, more caring, more supportive. These things are also true of women in general. They tend to be more nurturing, more supportive, more compassionate, more caring than men, just in general, for the most part. Now, it matters having both that mother and that father, both that paternal and that maternal impact, because the father tends to be the one that helps his boy develop into a law-abiding, productive member of society that we call a man. The father tends to help his son channel distinctively masculine aggressions in a constructive rather than a destructive manner. So what takes place with the 5-year-old in the living room, what takes place with the 10-year-old in the backyard, maybe tossing around a football, what takes place with the 15-year-old boy maybe upstairs in his bedroom tying a necktie for the first time, getting ready for a high school dance. All of those are occasions at which fathers can help their sons develop along this particular trajectory of boyhood into manhood. Now, I told some anecdotes to make you laugh, because I sometimes think actually that laughter and that anecdote can reveal the law that's written on the heart. When St. Paul talks about the natural law, he talks about a law written on the heart. And sometimes you can just tell and people realize the truth that's written there. But let me tell you some of the social science. Take a step back from the anecdote, look at the data. Boys who grow up without their fathers, more likely to commit crime, less likely to graduate from school, more likely to end up in jail, less likely to be employed. Because with the 5-year-old in the living room, the 10-year-old in the backyard, the 15-year-old getting ready for the dance, the father is doing something distinct and important for his sons. The father does something complementary for his daughters. Fathers, on average and for the most part, tend to be larger than mothers. Fathers, on average and for the most part, tend to have deeper voices than mothers. Fathers, on average and for the most part, tend to have once been young men themselves. And so fathers, on average and for the most part, tends to be the ones that scare away bad boyfriends. They tend to be the ones who police who their daughter is dating, who's pursuing their daughters. Again, some of the biological difference give the father a greater ability at scaring away the bad boyfriend. Some of the historical differences, having once been a young man themselves, they know what the wrong sort of young man might be looking for in their daughters. So they're more sensitive to these things. A father who's married to his daughter's mother also models what a good male-female relationship should look like, how a man should treat a woman, and what she might look for in a boyfriend, a potential fiancé, a potential husband. When you step back from the anecdote and look at the data, you see that girls who grow up without their fathers more likely to start sexual activity earlier in life, more likely to be pregnant outside of marriage, more likely to have an abortion. Because one of the things that the father does for his daughter is he helps protect a sphere of innocence. He helps protect his daughter's childhood to give her the space to develop into a young woman, free from some of the consequences of the sexual revolution. Don't just take my word for any of this. Let me read you a quotation, and then I'm going to ask you which right-wing nut job said this. Here's the quote. "We know the statistics. Children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to have behavioral problems, or run away from home, or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it." Who is it that said that? Is that Pope John Paul II? Is that Dr. James Dobson? Is that Rick Santorum? Who's the speaker? Obama. President Obama, before he evolved. And he gave us a hint about why he said this when he gave the commencement address at the all-male, historically black college, Morehouse. So he's the commencement speaker at Morehouse College. He's addressing a graduating class of all young black men, and this is what he says to them. He says, "I have tried to be for Michelle and my girls what my father was not for my mother and me. I want to break that cycle." So he's encouraging these young men to be good husbands, to be, at this point, good boyfriends, be good husbands, be good fathers. Now, I cite President Obama for 2 reasons. First is to say that whenever you're dealing with social science, you're dealing with laws of averages. So it's not as if you grow up without your father, without your mother, you're somehow destined to live in poverty and commit crime and drop out of school and go to jail. That's not what I want to suggest here. Regardless of your politics, regardless of where you fall in the partisan divide, whatever you think about President Obama's White House, you can't deny that he's lived a successful, flourishing life. That his mother and his grandmother were able to compensate for the fact that his father wasn't there for him and for his mother. So that's point one. But point two is that we also shouldn't minimize the consequences of broken families and family fragmentation. The reason Obama was speaking to that graduating class and talking about how his father wasn't there for him and for his mom, and the reason that he wants to be there for his daughters and for his wife, is precisely because he knows he's the exception that proves the rule. The majority of children in his situation aren't as fortunate as he is. And in most big cities, you can compare neighborhoods where the majority of the kids are born into and raised by their married moms and dads, and neighborhoods when it's the minority of children who are given that benefit in life. And when you look what makes the difference, it's not that these cities have, these neighborhoods in the same city, they have the same government, they have the same tax policies, the same curbside recycling, the same school district. The difference is family structure, and look at the outcome for the children who are born into and raised by their married moms and dads and the children who aren't given that benefit. This is what explains why the state takes an interest in marriage. Government's not in the marriage business because it's a sucker for romance. Government's not in the marriage business because it cares about the butterflies that you get in your stomach when you fall in love. If marriage was simply about consenting adult romance, you could get the state out of your bedroom. The reason government's in the marriage business is that the sexual union of a man and a woman can produce a child, and that child deserves both a mother and a father. And to get mothers and fathers to commit to each other and to commit to children, you need an institution. And that institution, throughout history, across the globe, we call it marriage, has been a way of both protecting the least among us, so it's a social justice institution. It's the best institution for fighting childhood poverty and promoting social mobility, and it's a limited government institution. It's the best way of combating crime and limiting the growth of the welfare state. So again, whether you're on the political left or the political right, I guess facing you, political left or the political right, cuts no difference here. If you're a social justice person or a limited government person, if you're a freedom person or an anti-poverty person, or if you're like me, I'm all of those things, you should care about marriage. Marriage is the best way of limiting the state, limiting the welfare state, limiting the police state, protecting against child poverty, and promoting social mobility. Which then leads to the final question, how does redefining marriage impact any of this? To get to the title of tonight's lecture, because I think it's only if you have this proper background can you then answer that question. And that the problem that we've faced in the United States for the past 10 years is that you had about 15 seconds on a cable news show. Piers Morgan would say, well, how does Adam and Steve getting married impact you and your marriage? And you had 15 seconds to answer, and people weren't persuaded. It's not surprising. If you have a fundamentally flawed understanding of human sexuality and of the purposes of marriage and the nature of the human person, you're not going to be able to undo it in a 15-second soundbite. And it can't just be that it's the same sex part of marriage that we're talking about. Tonight's lecture is focusing on a whole host of ways in which both gays and straights have misunderstood the nature of marriage, whether it's with permanency or with exclusivity or with monogamy or with sexual complementarity. All four of those marital norms have been under assault for the past 50 years. And the complementarity norm came last. It was only after monogamy and exclusivity and permanency were discarded that Anthony Kennedy could say, oh, it's no big deal if we get rid of complementarity as well. Which is simply to say that it's a cultural redefinition of marriage that leads to the legal redefinition of marriage. But then the legal redefinition of marriage will make the cultural redefinition of marriage even worse. That our culture shapes our law, but then our law will shape our culture. And so what I want to talk about are 4 ways in which the legal redefinition of marriage will have an impact on marriage and on society writ large. And all four of these follow the general rubric of ideas have consequences and bad ideas have bad consequences. That what's been at stake for the past decade that we've been debating these things, what's at stake now that Anthony Kennedy and the 4 liberal justices in the Supreme Court have redefined marriage in all 50 states, is that our law is replacing one understanding of marriage with a different understanding. Whereas marriage had historically been understood as a comprehensive union of sexually complementary spouses who live by the commitments of monogamy, exclusivity, and permanency, precisely because marriage is ordered towards childbearing and child rearing, and precisely because kids deserve moms and dads, that understanding of marriage is being replaced by an understanding of marriage where marriage is primarily about consenting adult romance and caregiving of whatever size or shape the consenting adults most desire, where the consenting adults get to set the terms and the conditions of the relationship itself. And that over time, as the law ceases to teach this understanding of marriage and starts to teach this understanding of marriage, the law will shape our culture will shape our beliefs, and then our beliefs will shape our actions. They'll shape your actions, they'll shape your children and your grandchildren's beliefs, they'll shape your children's and your grandchildren's actions. Because what your children and grandchildren will be taught both by the law and by the school systems and by Hollywood's culture is that marriage is simply about their consenting adult romantic relationships. And they get to set the terms and the conditions. Let me go through this in 4 steps. First consequence. Now that this court has redefined marriage, simply as a matter of reality in the United States, there is no public institution left that upholds the ideal that every child deserves both a mother and a father. To even say that a child deserves a mother and a father is very quickly being redefined as hate speech. I was in the Vatican just almost exactly a year ago. It was later in November of last year. It was for the Humanum conference, and if you're not familiar with this, do a quick Google search for Humanum. It was an international interfaith colloquium that Pope Francis organized. It had speakers from all of the world's religions. They disagree about more or less everything except one fact, and that's sexual complementarity. So it had Jews and Christians, both Catholic and Protestant, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, Jains, several other religions that I'm forgetting right now. That had over like 13 different world religions from all of the continents. And they were all sharing from their own traditions about the complementarity of male and female. And when Francis spoke, he said that a child has a right to both a mother and a father. One of the things that the left hates most about this pope, they love him on everything else except for that. That's why they were shocked when he was here that he visited with Kim Davis, that he visited with the Little Sisters of the Poor. We don't have an institution left in public life that even as an ideal, an aspirational goal, says that a child deserves a mom and a dad. What the redefinition of marriage does is it makes it primarily about the desires of the adults involved rather than the needs or the rights of the children involved. It turns a relationship that used to have both horizontal and vertical components, a horizontal connection between spouses and then a vertical component across the generations, that marriage was a generative union and that it could generate new life and then unite new life with a mom and a dad. It ignores, it chops off that generative part of marriage. So it just has the horizontal connection between the spouses rather than the vertical component of the rights of children. I mentioned at the beginning that today it's 40% of all Americans who are born to single moms, 50% of Hispanics, and 70% of African Americans. Many scholars have said that this is the greatest social crisis in the United States, that the marriage inequality that matters most is the inequality between children who are raised by their mom and dad and children who aren't. And so here's the question, and this is the first consequence. How do we say that those fathers are essential when the Supreme Court has redefined marriage to make fathers optional? That's the pedagogical function of this decision from the court. The pedagogical meaning the teaching function of the law. That'll be the consequence that your children and your grandchildren take from this decision. Second consequence is that the redefinition of marriage has no logical reason to stop here, that there's no limiting principle to this logic of redefinition. And the best way of illustrating this is to simply introduce you, if you don't already know these terms, to 3 new words that within the past 5 years activists on the left have created to describe where they would like to see future redefinitions of marriage. The first is the term throuple. A throuple is a 3-person couple. Take the word couple, chop off the C, and then add a THR. And if you think I'm joking, I came across this word in New York Magazine. New York Magazine is a prominent publication of Manhattanites. And this was a profile of 3 men who live in New York. They love each other, they sleep with each other, they cook meals for each other, they take care of each other. They want to have a joint checking account with each other, they want to file a joint tax return with each other. They want to inherit one another's wealth should one of them pass away. They want all 3 of their names on the mortgage to the house should they one day buy a house. They want to be a family. They want to be a marriage. On the logic of the revisionist view of marriage, they have a marriage. If marriage is simply about consenting adult romance and caregiving, don't they have a marriage? And if you go before the US Supreme Court and you sue for marriage equality for the same-sex couple, on what basis would you deny marriage equality for the same-sex throuple? Or for the opposite-sex quartet? I was inside of the Supreme Court during oral arguments. Justice Alito asked the Solicitor General, all right, well, let's take the example of 4 lawyers, so we don't have to worry about consent problems, right? So we don't have to, they always say, well, it won't be consensual. It's like 4 lawyers, they all know their rights, 2 men and 2 women, and they're a foursome, and they want to get married as an ensemble. On what basis do you deny them marriage equality if all that marriage is consenting adult romance and caregiving? The next term is the term monogamish. Well, actually, before I finish, let me just say, the reason that we got to monogamy, I mean, just to finish the point on the throuple, is that it's 1 man and 1 woman who can unite in the act that can make them one flesh. It's 1 man and 1 woman who can unite in the act that can make new life. And every new life has 1 mother and 1 father. So the reason historically we had monogamy in the law isn't because there's something magical about the number 2. It's not because there's something special about twosomes. It's precisely because of sexual complementarity, the capacity of a man and a woman to unite as husband and wife, to then be mother and father. But if marriage isn't about that, if sexual complementarity is outdated and bigoted, if mothering and fathering is irrational and arbitrary, what is your principled legal basis for monogamy? What is magical about the number 2? What's your principled basis for saying marriage equality only extends to twosomes and extends no farther? In 3 years of debating this issue on all of the nation's elite campuses, including Yale Law School and Harvard Law School and Stanford Law School and CU Boulder's Law School twice, I've never heard an answer to that question. Next term was the term monogamish. This was in the New York Times Sunday magazine. So again, it's not a fringe publication. The New York Times Sunday magazine is probably the most prominent publication of all of American public life. This was a profile of the gay rights activist Dan Savage. And they asked Dan Savage, what will straight couples learn from gay couples once we have marriage equality? How will redefining marriage change marriage for the better? And he said, redefining marriage to include same-sex relationships will teach straight people the virtue of the open relationship. The title of this New York Times article, you can Google it, is Married, with Infidelities. And Savage was redefining the vice of infidelity as the virtue of the monogamish relationship. He was saying that we have this outdated holdover from Judaism and Christianity of sexual fidelity, of exclusivity, that we expect marriage to be a relationship in which spouses are sexually faithful to one another. But that's inhumane, that's outdated. One person can't fulfill all of your sexual needs and desires for the rest of your life. And that's why people cheat on their spouses, and that's why people then get divorced because their hearts get broken. He says, don't have the unrealistic expectation in the first place. Have a realistic expectation that your marriage is about your romantic and your caregiving relationship, He says, provided that it's open and honest, there's no coercion and there's no deceit, spouses should be free to talk about the terms of having an open relationship, having a monogamish relationship. The last term's a little over 2 years old now. It was in the Washington Post just after the Supreme Court struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, written by a lawyer. And this was the word wed lease. Wed lease is a play on the word wedlock. If wedlock denotes something strong and sturdy and permanent, wed lease is meant to conjure up the image of the exact opposite. So just like you can lease a car or you can lease a house, you should be able to lease a spouse. That what makes marriage an outdated and inhumane institution is that we expect it to be permanent. We expect it to be till death do us part. But nothing in life is permanent. Everything is transitory. We can't make a promise to love another person for the next 60 or 70 or 80 years. That's inhumane. That's unrealistic. A better expectation would be to sign a temporary marriage license, a wed lease rather than wedlock. So you could have a 5-year wed lease. If it's going well, you could renew it. If it's not going well, it would just automatically dissolve. So you already have, just like you signed up for your dorm, it's not for the rest of your life, it's for the next 9 months, and come May, you leave the dorm, and next year you get a new dorm. Here you could have marriage. If you want to renew it, you can. If not, you can trade up for a newer model, just like you do with cars. Now, whatever you might think about the theology or the morality of thruples and wed leases and monogamish relationships, and I said I'm not going to talk about theology, I'm not going to talk about morality. I'll leave that to your chaplain. Just think about the public policy consequences. I said the reason the state's in the marriage business is to get one man and one woman to commit to each other permanently and exclusively so that any children that they create will have both a mother and a father. The thruple, the wed lease, the monogamish relationship directly undercut that public purpose of marriage because they increase the number of sexual partners that men and women have, and they decrease the amount of commitment that men and women make to one another. The monogamish relationship, the thruple, are increasing your number of partners, and then the wed lease is decreasing your commitment. But all three of these new words and the ideas that they represent follow as a logical matter, just like night follows on day, once you get rid of male-female sexual complementarity. Once you say marriage is just about consenting adult romance, then marriage could be between 2 or 3 or 4. So it could be a couple, a throuple, or a quartet. It could be sexually exclusive or sexually open. It could be temporary or it could be permanent. A way of thinking about this, if you're more visual, is that sexual complementarity is the foundation upon which monogamy and exclusivity and permanency are built. That sexual complementarity provides that foundation, the justification for those other marital norms. And once you wipe it away, it's only a matter of time before that logic plays itself out and those other norms become optional as well. So that's the second consequence. Let me mention the third and fourth more briefly because I think they're more readily apparent. The third consequence deals with unborn human life. And there are two ways in which to illustrate this, a conceptual level and then a more concrete level. The conceptual level is simply to say that the basic worldview that's enshrined in the redefinition of marriage is one of which consenting adults should do whatever consenting adults want to do. Or even increasingly, consenting teenagers should do whatever consenting teenagers want to do. That's the worldview that drives the demand side for abortion. That's the worldview that creates crisis pregnancies in the first place. When consenting adults or consenting teenagers are doing whatever consenting adults and teenagers want to do, that's when you're likely to find yourself pregnant outside of marriage and likely find yourself in a condition in which you're contemplating abortion. And so the redefinition of marriage solidifies the worldview in which adult sexuality is primarily about adults and the children will be fine no matter what. And if contraception fails, the abortionist is kind of the ultimate contraceptive. it's not that gays and lesbians are somehow to blame for abortion. I mean, that's obviously not what I'm saying. It's that this worldview, this philosophy of marriage that will now be further enshrined in our Constitution and in our schools will only further encourage that living out of human sexuality. Another way of illustrating this is to say that it's not impossible to be in favor of both same-sex marriage and chastity, but I've never heard someone actually endorse both same-sex marriage and chastity. It's not that it's impossible to do that, it's just I've never actually encountered someone who said, I'm in favor of gay marriage, I'm also in favor of chastity. Because the worldviews simply don't work at a conceptual level. The second iteration of this, the more concrete, is that many same-sex couples desire marriage equality, not just for themselves, but for future generations. Many same-sex couples desire a child of their own, and they will use assisted reproductive technologies to acquire a child of their own. And again, gays and lesbians aren't to blame for this. The creation and the utilization of assisted reproductive technologies for the past 40 or 50 years, since the first IVF child, Louise Brown, I guess it's 40 years ago now, have been heterosexuals. It was heterosexuals struggling with infertility who started and used IVF. Totally unregulated, but what the redefinition of marriage will do will further exacerbate that problem. One way of illustrating this is that in California, under their implementation of Obamacare, they have the inverse of the contraception mandate. They have a conception mandate. Every healthcare plan in California needs to cover assisted reproductive technologies for any couple who tries for a year and is unable to conceive a child. So the same-sex married couple tries for a year, still unable to conceive a child. They can then go to any healthcare plan in the state of California, has to cover assisted reproductive technologies. What do we know about that? We know that it's rife through with embryo destruction. So assisted reproductive technologies create many more embryos than are ever implanted, and of the embryos that are implanted, many are, the euphemism is selective reduction, selectively reduced. Because what they want is one child. They don't want to be octomom, right? But they might create 8 embryos, freeze 4 of them, implant 4 of them, and then weed out the 3 weakest of the 4 once they see how they implant and start developing. So if you're pro-life, you need to be concerned about how redefining marriage will change. Redefining marriage will redefine parenthood, and then redefining parenthood will redefine childhood and the creation of children. But it's not just that. I mean, it's not just the pro-life concern that's at risk here. It's also what this means for the women who will be the egg donors and the surrogate wombs. It tends not to be upper middle class Ivy League educated women who sell their eggs and rent their wombs. That tends not to be the demographic profile. It tends to be poorer women, more marginalized women who, for economic hardship reasons, are induced into selling their eggs, which is a very invasive and risky procedure, or to renting their room for 9 months to carry someone else's child. And so you need to be concerned about the risk for exploitation here. And then lastly, you need to be concerned about the children themselves. And for me, it was when I read an essay, 2 essays really, one by Katie Faust and one by Heather Barwick, both of whom are now young women, their 30s or 40s, raised by 2 mothers, each of them. Both of them were in favor of gay marriage until they got married and saw what their husbands were doing for their children. So they were raised by 2 moms. They still love their 2 moms, but it was only when they saw their husband fathering their kids that they saw what they had missed out on by not having a father. And that's what changed their mind about gay marriage. Whereas they were in favor of gay marriage, they wanted their 2 moms to have the right to marry, they're now speaking out against it. They both filed amicus briefs with the Supreme Court explaining this from the child's perspective. And the phrase that one of them used was that same-sex marriage creates an institution for missing parents. That it actually institutionalizes and incentivizes and encourages an institution in which a child will have 2 moms but no dad, or 2 dads but no moms. That nowhere else in public life do we incentivize that. Nowhere else do we institutionalize it. And that unlike, let's say, adoption or divorce and remarriage, this won't be because there was something that went wrong The parents, for some reason, are unable to raise their child, so we need adoptive parents. The marriage is so rife with conflict, we have to separate. This would be by design, right? From the very moment of conception, that child with the egg donor or the sperm donor or the surrogate womb is being created precisely to then be denied either a mother or a father. And so they were saying, well, what about the rights of the children involved here, and how redefining marriage will actually create a new institution precisely to then deprive them of either a mom or a dad. So that's the third consequence. The fourth consequence is the one that we've been living with most concretely, and that's the consequence for religious liberty. And if you're familiar with, I think it's, what is Jack's last name? It's Masterpiece Cake Shop here in Colorado. There have been a variety of professionals in the wedding industry who have been penalized by the government because they didn't want to lend their artistic gifts and talents to help celebrate a same-sex wedding. They had no problem baking a get-well-soon, all right, you don't really bake get-well-soon cakes. I guess baking the happy birthday cake, doing the get-well-soon flower bouquet. I've never received a get-well-soon cake. It depends on the illness. It might not be a bad idea. But they had no problem serving gay and lesbian customers. Their only objection was to the same-sex wedding. And the two best-known cases to mention, one involves a 71-year-old grandmother in Washington State, Baronelle Stutzman. She's a florist. She's employed gay people in her florist shop. She had no problem hiring gay people. She was serving this particular gay couple for 10 years. She was selling them flowers for a decade. It was only when Washington redefined marriage that they were then going to get married that they asked her, can you do the flowers for our wedding? She had to sit down with one of them and say, Roger, you know I love you guys, but I can't do a same-sex wedding. I'm an evangelical. I believe marriage is the union of a man and a woman, and I can't use my God-given artistic skills to help celebrate a lie about marriage. She was then sued by the Attorney General. Attorney General saying, we're not going to allow that sort of anti-gay bigotry in our state. In the neighboring state of Oregon, it's a young evangelical couple. I'm blanking on their names right now, but Aaron and Melissa Klein. They have 5 small children. They were running a bakery, Sweet Cakes by Melissa. They were asked by a same-sex couple, could you do the wedding cake? Wanted to have same-sex couple toppers. The cake that they eventually got had rainbow filling inside. They said, no, we can't do this. They were fined $135,000 by the Bureau of Labor and Industries in the state of Oregon for violating the rights of the same-sex couple and causing them emotional harms and pains. Now, it's not as if in the West Coast of Oregon and Washington State, conservative Christians have a monopoly on cake baking and floral arranging, right? There are plenty of people in Washington and Oregon who are in favor of gay marriage and who want to make money. So there was no need for the government to coerce this baker and this florist, and it's in Arizona, New Mexico where it's the photographer. There's no need to coerce these professionals into violating their beliefs. A part of America's ethos of live and let live would be that if you're in favor of gay marriage, bake the gay wedding cake. If you're not in favor of gay marriage, don't bake the gay wedding cake. But that's not what's happened, because this ultimately hasn't been about live and let live. It's been about using the force of law to coerce other people into accepting a new understanding of human sexuality, of marriage and the family, and of labeling that historic understanding the functional equivalent of racism. So it's not surprising that we've seen not just the wedding professionals, but Catholic charity adoption agencies have been shut down in 4 different jurisdictions because they wanted to find homes for children with married moms and dads, and the government said that's discrimination against same-sex married couples. This does nothing to help orphans find homes. Shutting down adoption agencies doesn't increase the number of providers. It doesn't increase the number of families. Catholic Charities wasn't preventing gay and lesbian couples from adopting from the state-run adoption agency. They weren't standing in the way of them adopting from the other civil society agencies. They just said, for our adoption agency, we have a great track record of finding moms and dads. We want to continue finding moms and dads. And when they said they had a great track record, they weren't lying. They had some of the most success at placing the hardest to place kids. Everyone wants to adopt a newborn baby. They were able to place 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds with behavioral problems into homes. And whether you could be an optimist or a pessimist here, whether it's because of Christian charity or Catholic guilt, one way or the other, they were able to get families who otherwise weren't inclined to adopt a 10-year-old with behavioral problems into their homes. They were doing something that these other agencies couldn't. They're no longer allowed to do that. And so again, you see, because of political correctness, children are the ones who are the victims here, right? Fewer children are being found homes in those jurisdictions. And then during oral arguments, we heard the Solicitor General, in response to a question from Justice Alito, he said, well, we know about the case of Bob Jones University. The IRS revoked the nonprofit tax status of a Christian school because they had a policy against interracial dating on campus. He said, what's going to happen to all of the religious schools who continue to teach and to have campus policies that respect marriage as the union of a man and a woman? Will they lose their nonprofit tax status? And the answer that the Solicitor General gave was, I don't deny it, Justice Alito, that's going to be an issue. I don't deny it, it's going to be an issue. It was a chilling moment in the courtroom, because normally lawyers tell judges what they want to hear. And so he could have just said, oh no, Justice Alito, we would never do that. We know that Orthodox Jews and Roman Catholics and evangelicals and Latter-day Saints and Muslims, they all have these rich theologies of male-female sexual complementarity, and this isn't the same thing as racism. We would never take away their nonprofit tax status. That's not what he said. 2 days after the Supreme Court announced its marriage ruling, the religion columnist for the New York Times wrote an op-ed for Time magazine titled, "Now's the Time to Revoke Nonprofit Tax Status to Religious Schools," using the occasion of the redefinition of marriage to get rid of the nonprofit tax status. Imagine how difficult it would be if the various parochial schools in the United States were for-profits, having to pay taxes on all of the donations that they receive, having to pay property taxes. They're barely getting by now. You hear news stories day after day of dioceses that are shutting down schools, consolidating their programs. If they're barely getting by now, how would they get by if the government increases their tax burden? And what's remarkable here is that Catholic schools frequently are educating non-Catholics in inner city school systems and producing better outcomes in the public schools. So again, who would be the primary victims of this outcome? It would be some of the least well-off children in our society, that Catholic schools do a miraculous job at educating where public schools seem to fail. And the basic idea here, and this is what I'm going to close on, is that for the past decade or longer, the argument that we've heard is that if you are against marriage equality, meaning that you're against redefining marriage to include same-sex couples, you're just like the racists who were against interracial marriage, and the law should treat you the same way the law treats racists. So again, I said that this is all about ideas having consequences, bad ideas having bad consequences. If the law comes to treat the conviction that we're created male and female, and that male and female are created for each other, as if it's racism, you only have to ask yourself, how does the law treat racists, to figure out what the long-term trajectory is on this issue, unless people like you and me are willing to make the counter-argument. So the reason why I'm willing to do these sorts of campus visits and give these talks and write these books and articles is precisely because I see what the logic would be if the other side goes uncontested in simply saying that this foundational belief about human anthropology is the functional equivalent of irrational bigotry. So what it requires from someone like me, and hopefully from people like you, is the willingness to make the counter-argument, to explain why this isn't at all like racism, and why the belief that we're created male and female and that male and female are created for each other is not only true, but it's good and it's beautiful, and the government shouldn't be penalizing it as if it's a form of unjust bigotry. So with that, I'll stop, and it looks like we have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you.
I'm going to stand over here because the mic is very attached. We will start question and answers. With this, I would like you to encourage you not to come up with statements, but rather questions. And you can form lines at either microphone. And we'll go ahead and start. Thank you so much, Dr. Ryan Anderson.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Quan. I go to CSU. I'm a Christian, I'm black, and I'm married. A couple points that you said, you talked about what is marriage, and it seemed to me that all you pretty much said it was is for procreation of children. I, for one, didn't get married just to put a kid into my wife. I also didn't get married to just have sex with her. It was for love and commitment, as well as I do realize that because now that I'm married, I get a lot of tax benefits, and I get to protect my property rights even after death. That is the essential reason why people are looking for equality in the political space. That is why the government is involved, given the bigotry that we saw in biracial marriage. It seems to me that what you're arguing for is not against same-sex marriage, but rather same-sex parenting. Would that be accurate?
Sorry.
So it's both. I mean, so I think you misunderstood, so let me try to clarify what I was trying to say. So, I mean, I don't think the primary purpose of marriage is just to put a baby into your wife. What I argued here is that marriage is about a comprehensive union. It's about uniting with your wife comprehensively at all levels of your humanity and her humanity. So it's going to be a union of hearts, minds, and bodies. And of course, it's a loving commitment, right? I mean, so to unite with another person is always a union of wills, which will be hopefully a union of loving wills, because that's the disposition we should have towards everyone. What makes the marital union and the marital commitment and the marital relationship different than other relationships is precisely that bodily, that sexual part, because that's what makes it change from an ordinary friendship into a comprehensive relationship. But that also then explains why marriage has the unique trajectory that it was. So unlike freshman year roommates, they're not ordered towards creating new life and then raising new life. But the marital union itself, in the spousal love between husband and wife, is by its very nature ordered towards creating new life and then attaching new life with both a mother and a father. So this can explain both what marriage is and why it matters in a way that other sorts of consenting adult relationships don't. The answer to your other part of your question about tax benefits and burdens, and depending on where you are currently on the income scale, it may be all benefits, but at some point you'll quickly realize there are also burdens to marry, given the way that how we tax people who are married. Rather than doing two separate single tax returns, you'll do a joint tax returns, and it could quickly bump you into a higher tax bracket. But regardless, they're both benefits and burdens of marriage, and the question is, well, what sort of relationship are you going to treat as a marital relationship? And if it's simply about pulling together resources, commingling assets, what is your response to the throuple? What is your response to the wed lease? What is your response to the monogamish relationship? There are consenting adults who want to commingle their assets with 3 consenting adults for only a 5-year time period while being open to having other sexual relationships. If the state is going to treat all consenting adult relationships equally, the logic of marriage equality ultimately leads to dissolving marriage into contract law. So it strikes me that marriage either is something with an objective nature and structure, which then is what allows for the state to actually recognize marriage, or marriage simply doesn't exist, and we simply have consenting adult romance of as many different sizes and shapes as consent can come in.
I'd love to answer your question.
Sure, yeah.
With regards to the throuple or multi-relationship, I believe that if a corporation is considered a person, and we have all these different other tax and money exemptions for multiple organizations, multiple partnerships, I believe that multiple people in a household should be able to have the same thing with regards to the economic benefits. So you're still you're negating the fact that the people who have a problem with what the things that you have to say don't have a problem with Christian marriage. There's nothing wrong with Christian marriage. Christian marriage is great. And as you said, as you failed to say, I guess, Christianity, the church, can be, I believe, the institution that continues to perpetuate your ideas about caring for children and stuff like that. However, in the economic sphere, in the political sphere, what matters is how we're going to regulate the dollars and the property rights. That is the main reason why people have gone for that. And I think ignoring that and trying to conflate them is short-sighted.
Sure. So I disagree with that. So I just think that's not the main reason why the state's been in the marriage business. What you've just described is why the state is in the contract business, why state's in the corporation business. And so you've really just reduced the marital relationship into contract law and corporation law. And I think that would be
Do you have any
huge,
law that says
so I think
the
that would,
opposite of
what's
that?
that?
Do you have any a law that says the opposite? Does
Yes,
any-
I mean the reason why marriage was a permanent, exclusive, monogamous union, and there are no other corporate laws or contract law that assumed that when you enter into a contract it needs to be permanent and exclusive monogamous, is that the marital relationship is different than business relationships. So it's not just about economic dollars and cents. The reason that the state took a particular interest in this type of relationship is precisely because of its capacity to create new life, that the state
Can you
needs
cite that? Can
to
you
have.
cite that?
I mean, if you read at either of my books, they're full of footnotes. If you read the Supreme Court opinions that cited me, they thought I was a credible source on this. So I mean, like, I can't give you right now chapter and verse citations, but I'm not talking about Christian marriage either. So I mean, I thought it was interesting that you said you're talking about Christian marriage. I'm talking about marriage, that it's a human reality based upon human nature, and this matters not just for Christian babies, this matters for all children. It's important for all children, whether their parents are Christian or not, that they be born into a permanent, exclusive, committed relationship where they have the best chance possible being raised by their mother and their father. And that's the reason governments have historically gotten involved in the marriage business. If sexual relationships never produced children, government would have never gotten involved in marriage. We would have only had contract law and corporate law. But it's precisely because there is something unique about
Can't cite
our
any legal
embodiment.
provision that says that that is the true purpose and that was the intention.
I mean,
of
so
it.
here's what I would say with you. Read Blackstone. So start by looking at Blackstone. Read John Locke. Read Plato and Aristotle.
Are those politicians?
No, these are philosophers. I tend to think the philosophers are more interesting to read than the politicians. But if you think Donald Trump's entertaining, read the politicians. But I prefer to read the philosophers. Yep.
So you cited the sexual revolution as the basis for all of this. So I guess I kind of wonder, in my head, it would be more of the feminist revolution, going a step sort of further back. So what your thought is about perhaps the feminist revolution being the basis for everything that happened after that?
Yeah, I mean, so to a certain extent, I mean, I think it all depends on the wave of the feminist revolution. So I don't think that Susan B. Anthony would be cheering on same-sex marriage. I also don't think she would be cheering on abortion. I think that the feminist movement got hijacked or got co-opted or got radicalized when the confluence of the sexual revolution. That the early feminists fighting for women's suffrage, they viewed abortion, for example, as a harm both against children and against women. And I think it's later feminists who then viewed it more as a liberationist agenda. Early feminists thought it was actually important that marriage be equal between spouses, so they thought mutuality was important, but they also thought it was important that the husband and the father lived up to those marital norms, right? That the husband needed to be just as chaste as the wife, that the double standard was in expecting chastity from women but not expecting it from men. Their solution wasn't to say expect chastity from neither. Their solution was expect chastity from both. And then I think it's with the sexual revolution that I think feminism more goes off the rails, and then you get kind of a counter view of feminism in like the 90s and the last decade. Does that make sense? Perfect. I guess this side.
Due to time, we just have one more question, but then Dr. Ryan Anderson will be available afterwards. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mandy. I go to CSU. I guess my question was, during your speech tonight, you frequently mentioned man and a woman coming together to create a child, ignoring the fact that some couples are infertile, some couples choose not to have children, and sometimes trans people exist and trans people matter. And so you could have a same-gender couple who can procreate, living together. Also, intersex people exist and matter. And I feel like your definition of marriage between a man and a woman is exclusionary in that. Can you speak on that?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, the basic idea here is that if you think about what makes the government take an interest in the marital relationship, it's that not every marriage will result in a child, but every child is the result of a male-female coupling. Every child is the result of a man and a woman who unite, the result of a sperm and an egg that unite, and that is what gets the state saying we need an institution that channels that type of a desire, that type of sexual desire, into something that's stable and permanent and hopefully exclusive, so that that child will then have relationship with both the mother and the father who helped create them. So the answer about infertility is to say that legislation is typically done at the wholesale, not the retail level. So you don't inquire whether or not any given couple is fertile or infertile. What you look at is, are they the type of relationship that has the capacity to unite as one flesh, and that at least in kind of the abstract has the capacity to create new life and then unite new life with a mother and a father. Whether or not every given instance of that type of relationship in fact results in a child doesn't take anything away from the public purpose or the pedagogical function of marriage. Whereas redefining marriage to have same-sex couples or thruples or larger ensembles would be teaching something new about marriage. It would be teaching that marriage primarily is about the consenting adult romance of the couples involved, and that children will be fine regardless of the type of parenting structure that they receive. And so that's why I think it's rational and reasonable for the state to say, we recognize all marriages in law, because even an infertile marriage is still a marriage, knowing that not every marriage is going to impact the political common good in the way that the majority of marriages do.
Okay, you still haven't touched on trans people, because you can have two men, one of whom has a penis, the other has a vagina, who can create a child. And why would you deny them the right to marry? Because if they're in a committed, monogamous relationship and they do choose, for the sake of argument, they do choose to have a child, they've fulfilled all of your criteria.
Sure.
Why would you
Well, so
deny
in
them?
this understanding of marriage, if one of them has a penis and one of them has a vagina, they can get married.
But if they're
I mean, so on this understanding of marriage, I mean, I'm not sure why you're saying they're excluded, right? So they can unite as one flesh. They can unite, and the sperm from the penis can unite with the egg from the ovaries and then come out as a child, right? So I don't see what the limitation here is.
Because if both of them have chosen to transition, then they would both be men on driver's license, personal identification, marriage certificates. They would be two men married with a child. And if you would deny them that, then why would you deny any other two men? who
Right.
may
So
or may not choose to have a child?
I think the simpler solution here is, rather than redefining marriage, it would be to not redefine their gender. I mean, I mean, I think that the simpler solution here wouldn't be, let's change the entire institution of marriage because of the reality of transgender individuals. It would be, for the sake of the marriage license here, maybe we shouldn't be looking at their gender identity, but we should be looking at their biological sex.
Okay, but gender and sex are separate, and forcing someone to invalidate their identity to get married is wrong.
Right. So my point here is that rather than forcing anyone to invalidate their identity, what I'm suggesting is that what we would look to here would be their biological sex. What I'm interested in is, it's the man and a woman who can unite as husband and wife, be mother and father to their children. That's the social reality that we're trying to account for. If there are people who identify in different ways, rather than relying on their self-identities, we can still look at these underlying biological realities.
Okay, but that's not the reality that we live in. You would
I mean, so
still
we
be-
disagree.
Yeah, but you would still be asking someone to be the woman on the marriage certificate.
No, I mean,
Thus-
so I mean, if your concern here is that someone would have to be listed as husband and someone as wife, you could more easily change it to spouse and spouse. I mean, if that's the
So
concern.
how is that different than what we have right now with the Supreme
Because,
Court?
because I mean, the problem here is that I think it's a problem if you change the actual institution to exclude the expectation of male-female sexual complementarity. Right? I mean, the purpose here is that, as we went through in the 4 consequences of redefining marriage, is that if you redefine marriage, it will actually teach that marriage is a different type of thing, that marriage requires different sorts of commitments from spouses, and that children have different sort of rights vis-a-vis their parents. I have no interest in denying someone's identity in the way that you seem to keep wanting to push me to answer your question in a certain way. I have no interest in doing that, so I'm trying to actually find a common sense solution that would actually satisfy both of the interests here. But I'm not going to then use the willingness to find a compromise, common sense solution to then say we should actually throw out the entire understanding of what marriage is. Right? I mean, I think that's the problem where you're suggesting we go a little bit too far.
Okay. I just don't see how the physical reality of having spouse and spouse on a marriage certificate should be any different for anybody. Like,
Okay, but I mean, like, if you don't see it, there's, I mean, I can't
Afraid I
force
don't.
you to see something. You know, I can explain it to you, but I can't understand it for you. I mean, that's just like the limitation of what we can do in a public forum. So I guess with that, we're out of time. Thank you, guys.